Good morning. Welcome to the IR Theory interview series. I am Dr. Jon Obert, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Global Political Studies, GPS, at Malmö University, Sweden. In this interview series, we interview IR scholars about their preferred theoretical perspectives. The idea is to get a brief account of why scholars have come to appreciate a certain IR theory through a short interview. Today, I have the honor to interview a good friend of mine who is also a great scholar. Welcome, Dr. Obert Hodzi.
Thank you.
It's so nice to have you here. Please, before we start with the specific questions about IR theory and your preferred theoretical perspective, could you please tell me a little bit about your scholarly background?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me for this discussion. I'm a lawyer by profession. So I did a law for my undergrad. Then I transitioned to political science. I did a master's in democratic governance and civil society. So to some extent, that explains things that I'll talk about later, why I have an appreciation of domestic politics and how it affects foreign policies of certain countries. I then did a PhD in political science, and I looked more on China's intervention in African civil wars. So in short, I'd say that's my background.
Yeah, and you did your PhD at a very famous university, right?
Yeah, Lingnan University,
Yeah.
beautiful small university, but it was a great experience.
Yeah.
And I kind of like appreciate being in a small university where you can cultivate good relations, where relations are not superficial, because that's sometimes the challenge with bigger universities. So at least I could explore many other things that I didn't really understand very well. And for me, because it was also a big transition to doing research at a higher level in international relations, which wasn't really my undergrad background. So it helped me to transition in a more relaxed environment and more conducive environment for people who are coming from a different discipline into a new discipline. So it was a great experience. I really liked it.
Yeah, and that is also where we met.
Yes.
Yeah, it was an awesome time as well, and a lot of good friends on the road and nice study experience.
Sure.
All right, we will talk more about that another time perhaps. But I mean, you specialize in China-Africa relations, and you have done compelling research on African agency and African political elites in relation to said topic. You also identify as a neoclassical realist. What are some of the neoclassical realist insights when it comes to IR research in general and in relation to China-Africa relations in particular?
I think one of the things that attracted me to neoclassical realism is because I'm interested in political elites and the influence that they have in the directions that their states take in their foreign policies. And I wanted something that could help me explain the foreign policy behaviors of small states or rising powers. Most of the international relations theories, they take it for granted that international relations is for global powers like the US and the like. So I wanted something that helps me to look at countries that I'm interested in, China, which is a rising power, African countries that are usually ignored and seen as passive. And neoclassical realism, because it looks at the external and internal variables to explain international outcomes. I thought that was really interesting and exciting to look at. And I would say generally it looks at how the scope and ambition of a country's foreign policy is first and foremost shaped by its position in the international system. So if you look at a small country, I can pick any small country in Africa, like Gambia, for instance. What is its position in the international system? And if we want to use classical realism or other realist concepts, it would just be useless to look at it, as some would say. This is a country, of course, it's there, but it doesn't really matter on international issues because it doesn't really exist in the world of global powers. but also it goes further to then look at the internal unit level variables in those countries to understand how political leaders, how political elites in those countries capitalize on their position in the international system and then unit level variables in their countries to make foreign policy decisions. And if you take that to a rising power like China, it'll be very interesting, and I thought it was quite interesting for me to look at how it combines unit level factors, variables in China, and its position in the international system, and how that can explain its behavior in Africa, its behavior in the global south and in many other regions. So that, I would say in a nutshell, is the reason why I thought neoclassical realism would be great to look at what I really wanted to look at.
Mm. Okay, so if we compare neoclassical realism to other realisms, like offensive realism, for instance, why would you say that neoclassical realism is more suitable than offensive realism that to explain China's foreign policy, for instance?
Okay, so if it will not help us to understand why China possibly behaves differently from the way that Japan behaved when it was a rising power and it was seeking more regional influence, if we can say. Why is China not using its military capabilities or not gravitating towards war and military action in its fight with the US? Why is it opting for geo-economic instruments, for instance, or geo-economic issues? Why is China behaving differently from other rising powers that rose before it? And I think offensive realism will not help us to look at that, will not help us to understand why China why security doesn't seem to be a major preoccupation that China has, and why if we look at its relations with the US, if we look at how it has advanced its influence in Africa, why security doesn't seem to be at the top of its priority. So I think neoclassical realism covers that gap.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And if we are to choose two core neoclassical realist concepts, which ones would you choose and why? So we make it a little bit more specific.
I would think relative material capabilities. I think it's a very important concept in neoclassical realism, because we want to look at, so that the starting point is that how states behave, or the foreign policy decisions that it makes, are determined by its relative position, relative material capabilities, or relative material power, as some would want to put it. So if we look at China relative to other states, what is its material capabilities like, and how does it influence its foreign policy behaviors? So relative material capability is important because it also helps us to understand why Zimbabwe would behave the way that it would behave, and that why it would be different from maybe China or India or other rising powers. And then the second thing is perceptions of threat. So the perception of threat is quite interesting. Why does the US feel threatened by China and not India? I think the reason is simply the perception of threat that political leaders or ruling elites in the US have towards China, vis-a-vis their perception of threat from India. So those two concepts, I think they're quite important, because they help us to tease out why a country like China, in its relations with the US, would behave differently from its relations with other powers, or how countries with similar relative or comparable relative material capabilities will behave differently.
Yes.
Right.
So if we would have only stayed at the system level, looking only at the material structure, or looking only at the distribution of power in the system in terms of relative material capabilities, we would not understand that point that you're emphasizing. Hence, we also have to bring in other concepts like threat perception, which you would locate at the domestic level of analysis or even individual level of analysis among certain core leaders. And hence this combination of system level variables and state level variables and perhaps even individual level variables is then important, you would argue, to understand why the US considers China a threat and not India a threat, for instance.
Yes, that's precisely it.
Okay.
Because then in that sense we would reach a conclusion that states with comparable material capabilities have to behave in the same way, and we won't be able to explain why states with comparable material capabilities behave differently.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer and those two concepts. In terms of policy relevance then, how would neoclassical realism inform policy?
I think the important argument that is made by Gideon Ross, which I think makes a lot of sense and is very relevant to this question, is it says that for us to be able to understand the link between power and policy, we need to look at the context within which foreign policies are formulated and implemented. So the context, then we're looking at the unit level context, the domestic context, and then we're looking at the international system, the international context. So that really helps us to understand, like if I can take it back to my PhD research, why would China not intervene militarily in African conflicts when its interests are affected? So for us to be able to understand that non-intervention policy that China has and why it might be changing that policy, we need to be able to look at the context within China and then China's position in the international system, and then why it is behaving in the way that it is behaving, and possibly different from other powers. So if we look at how China doesn't want other countries to intervene in its Taiwan issues, in its Hong Kong issues, in Tibet, in many other issues, internal issues, that is an important element for us to understand that because of its domestic context, China may not want to intervene in other countries' internal affairs because it doesn't want to set a precedent so that other countries can be able to do the same thing, right? But so I guess that's how it can be relevant in understanding,